Hey, welcome to the NextDrop Question. I'm Mohamed Ateia. This is a short conversation series where I ask one focused question to experts working at the front lines of water, contaminants, environment, and practical solutions. Hello from Dallas. I'm attending the Battelle Chlorinated Conference, and I'm very happy to be speaking with Ali Ling. Ali is an assistant professor of civil engineering at the University of St. Thomas. Her work focuses on wastewater treatment, emerging contaminants, and the practical economics of PFAS management. What I really appreciate about Ali's perspective is that she looks beyond the question of whether treatment can work. She also asks what it costs, who pays, and how those decisions affect utilities and communities. In this conversation, we will talk about PFAS treatment costs and why simply cost per gallon, the numbers there are rarely enough to support good decisions. So let's get to it.
Okay, so you have a panel tomorrow.
Yep.
And that will cover the PFAS cleanup cost. I guess the discussion, it depends on the circle that you will be engaging with. Like treatment circles, utilities will have a different flavor about the same topic versus in a remediation circle, etc. So maybe this is something that you have published very key papers about that, and maybe if you can explain how you see the topic if we just zoom out a little bit.
Yeah, I think when we talk about costs to remediate or to treat, you need to be thinking about a cost-benefit metric to try to prioritize and make the most use of the limited amount of funds that we have. And the benefit that you compare it to is going to depend on what is the goal. So it's, costs to do what? What is it that you're trying to do? So if we're thinking about it from a drinking water lens, you typically are trying to directly reduce exposure and intake through the drinking water route. If we're thinking about a lot of remediation settings, those are mostly related to trying to reduce the mass of PFAS in the environment. There's some remediation settings, of course, that have a downstream receptor, but by and large, in the remediation sector, I think costs we need to be thinking about in terms of costs per kilogram of PFAS, either removed, destroyed, sequestered, but kind of taken away from the general mobile mass of PFAS in the environment.
Okay, so that is, I guess, a key distinction when we talk about cost, because once we start mixing the two concepts, it becomes more confusing than helpful. So how do you normally start the process about that thought process in treatment versus remediation? I guess the conference here is just full of remediation experts, and I would assume that would be the main lens. But what is your strategy in actually making sure that that distinction is always clarified to the audience?
Right, and it's not a binary. Of course, there's some things that are going to be mostly risk and some mass reduction, and some things that are going to be mostly mass reduction and some risk reduction. I think, if it's cost per exposure reduction for drinking water, finding a way to try to characterize what that exposure reduction is, whether that's, you could do it in terms of risk, cancer risk or non-cancer risk, or just in terms of like mass of PFAS that's not going into someone's bodies. There's various assumptions you need to make. Drinking water is a little easier because you can assume, the basic EPA risk calculations for exposure and ingestion, but is really kind of trying to characterize like what is the risk that you're trying to reduce, and can you try to quantify it in a way such that you can look at the cost per risk reduction. And then on the other side, there's the cost per mass of PFAS removed, trying to characterize that. And you can really see that those costs per mass of PFAS is really changing as you go from the downstream remediation after it's already out there in the environment, going upstream to reducing emissions, and then farther upstream to reducing uses.
So what do you think? Like, you started 3 years ago that exercise about Was it global?
Yeah, the goal was to figure out, like, if we're thinking about the globe as a steady state, trying to get to steady state PFAS in the environment, we would need to remove PFAS from the environment at the same rate that we're putting it into the environment.
Okay, so that was the global lens, and of course, the numbers there were not to start saving to meet them. It was just like an illustration of how unrealistic that goal would be if we just stick to the current way of thinking. And recently you had that follow-up, but mostly focus on Europe, because that's another model with very interesting also kind of priorities and assessment frameworks that they have. What changed between the two kind of exercises?
Yeah, so the takeaway from the first paper from 2024 was we can't afford to remove PFAS from the environment as fast as we're putting in, that cost would be greater than the global GDP. This one that we have one in press, and then there's one that's hopefully submitted soon. One of them is looking at Europe, and one of them is looking at the US. And what we've done is we've taken publicly available databases on drinking water facilities, wastewater facilities, landfills, biosolids that are land applied, and contaminated sites, and basically said if we were to remediate either all of them or some subset based on potential regulatory frameworks in the future, what would that cost in the EU? But I think the most important question that we asked there is not necessarily what would it cost, it's how much of the PFAS could we actually get to with that level of wide-scale remediation. So all of those waste management pathways I just mentioned, plus like pretty extensive site remediation. And we found there that all of it going through wastewater, landfill, leachate, and contaminated sites, heavily contaminated sites, taking care of all of those would still only get at less than 1% of current PFAS emissions. There's a lot of nuances there, so we were focusing on like C4 to C10, PFAS and their precursors, but less than 1% of current emissions, which means that most of the PFAS that are coming out there into the world are not going through wastewater or landfills. They're going through some more diffuse route, which I don't actually know exactly where that is. I suspect a lot of it is through air, some through stormwater. But I think that's an area we really need to better understand, so that if we're going to mitigate environmental PFAS, we can try to mitigate some of those bigger sources.
Okay, so thank you for everything that you are doing, and looking forward actually to reading the papers when they come out. So,
yeah.
Ali Ling,
Thanks for the discussion, Moha.
Yep.
That was the next drop question. Thanks for listening. See you next time.